All right. Well, thanks for clicking play there and joining us for our conversation with Sam Adler-Bell, who is a co-host with Matt Sitman of the great Know Your Enemy podcast, which is sponsored by Dissent magazine, I think still. Is that correct?
Yeah.
The shows, these are your own words, or I think my summary of your characterization of the show online, probably a leftist guide to the conservative movement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is me describing the show. It takes seriously and substantively the conservative movement, and it does so knowledgeably, which makes for an interesting and informative show. Sam himself writes regularly about the same things, among many other things. He had a great article recently in the New Republic on the young intellectual upstarts trying to reinvent the right. And in his work, he's addressed various aspects of conservative philanthropy as well. So we figured we'd ask him if he'd come talk to us, and he nicely agreed. So just to start, Sam, where's home for you?
I live in Brooklyn. I'm a little bit of a cliche, a socialist living in Brooklyn, New York. I'm from right outside Hartford, Connecticut, Canton, Connecticut.
How does a nice guy like you end up running a podcast or co-hosting a podcast sponsored by Dissent magazine? Are you part of the liberal movement, or how did you get from how'd you get here?
It's a good question. I ask myself that question all the time. How did I get here? I've always been on the left, and sometimes when we get profiled, journalists ask me if I count as a red diaper baby, which is not the case. My parents were not members of the Communist Party, but they are progressives. They've always been on the left. They're left-wing lawyers. And so I grew up in a milieu where left-wing ideas were totally normative, totally normal. I inherited being a left-winger in a way. I had, my ways of rebelling against my parents, but which was mostly just to be even more left-wing than them. Whereas my co-host, Matthew Sitman, grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist conservative family in central Pennsylvania. Pat Buchanan would call it the conservatives of the heart. And then he became more of a conservative of the mind when he went to graduate school, and was sort of, I probably got a lot of fellowships from funders in your network of philanthropic organizations, and was sort of in the pipeline to be a conservative intellectual, and then had his own kind of various road to Damascus moments, and ended up converting to the left. And so the combination of our two perspectives, which is that I've always been on the left and always been interested in the right, and Matt grew up on the right, and became interested in the left and moved to the left, means that that's, I think, the value out of the podcast. And doing it, I always say, is that it has defamiliarized the left for me. I have to actually think a lot harder than I used to about why I'm a left-winger, why I'm a liberal, why I'm a progressive, as opposed to just accepting it as the water that I swim in. And so that's really what I love about doing the podcast, is that until I started thinking about the right more and reading more about the right, I had really only been exposed to, frankly, the stupidest, the least artful, the least literary versions of right-wing thought. And that made it easy to be a left-winger. And I think that's probably true for a lot of liberals. And maybe we'll get there later, but I think that's also true for a lot of people on the right. They're only exposed to the most odious versions of left-wing ideas, the least sophisticated version of left-wing ideas. And then so you never really are challenged to figure out why you believe the things that you do.
Are liberals and conservatives enemies? Is the usage of that term sort of tongue-in-cheek, or what we make of enemies of each other? I'll say, are we really enemies?
We'll find out later. Yeah. we always say that the name of the podcast is a little tongue in cheek. We started it in 2019, and it was really around then that we were noticing the kind of neo-Schmittian, Carl Schmittian impulse on the right, the sort of idea that politics is reducible to the friend and enemy distinction, and seeing a lot more kind of pugnacious right-wingers embracing the idea that the left is our enemy. And it's always been the case, I think, that there are people on the left who consider the right their enemy. But the irony, I think, is, if, as you know from listening to the podcast, and that other people will see or hear if they listen to the podcast, while we don't try to reduce political distinctions, ideological distinctions, deeply felt first principle distinctions between political opponents, we are trying to really understand our political opponents in a way that is not based exclusively on enmity. Matt will always say, if he was here, he would say, as a Christian, he's a Christian, I'm a Jew, but he would say that as a Christian, you have to love your enemy. And in order to love your enemy, you also have to know them.
Yeah. So, well, I assume I know your answer to this question. Do liberals know their enemy well enough? Or I guess I'll say, understand their enemy well enough. One would presume, because you have this podcast.
Yeah,
I think so. But I'll let you answer without me answering for you. How about that? But what's the gap you're trying to fill here?
Well, yeah, I know. I obviously we do the podcast because we think there's something missing. I would say that, like I said earlier, I think that it's easy to go through political life, be a politically engaged reader, and not encounter sophisticated arguments from your political opponents. And I think that doing so is beneficial. I haven't, people often ask me in doing the podcast, do I find myself becoming more sympathetic to conservative arguments? But I actually, for the most part, I don't, but I have to figure out why. I can't just settle for the idea that, one of the things that I often think is that certainly people on the left assume that people on the right are either self-consciously evil or stupid. And I think that that's a comfort to people to imagine that their political opponents are either, malicious or stupid. But if you accept the idea that no, they are probably attached to their political ideas in some way that's comparable to the way that you're attached to yours, that they help them make sense of the world in the same way that your political ideas help you make sense of the world, then it actually makes it harder to figure out, to actually do politics, or in a way, it's more unsettling to understand that people really believe the things that they say, and they don't just believe them because they're dupes. Yeah. And I think that on both sides, we probably rely on that assumption because it's comforting, and it gives us it makes us somewhat complacent in our own beliefs.
Right. Many people who would say you need to know your enemy on either side would then say the reason you need to know your enemy is so you can beat them better. Yeah. But that, I'm sensing, I don't know, you tell me, that you enjoy the intellectual exercise for the for the benefit, selfish benefit, as it were, but also for just the enjoyment of the exercise, or is that not true? Do you really just want to?
No, that's definitely true for me. I don't. I think that we have to. I think often our left-wing listeners do listen to it because they want to know how to win better, how to beat the right. And I want the right to lose. I won't kid around with you. I want the left to win. But the thing that I enjoy about doing the podcast is the intellectual endeavor. And I think one of the things that is hard for people to understand sometimes is that that there's a very specifically American liberal, and I mean small L liberal idea that that the point of understanding is that you come to some sort of place in the middle. That's not really what we do on the podcast, and it's not really my goal. That I just think that if you accept that it's very interesting to learn about, even talk to people who fundamentally disagree with you, maybe disagree with you about the most precious, the most important things in your life. It's fascinating, especially if you don't go into it assuming that the goal is that we're going to find some common ground in the middle. That might be a worthy goal for certain kinds of conversations, and certainly in a liberal democracy, you have to do some of that. But our podcast isn't Congress, and so we're it's perfectly all right with us to not find agreement, but certainly find to clarify what our disagreements are.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, why don't we finish up with part one there and pick up with part two in a bit?